everyone! As you can see by the title, Mexie Responded. Like my original response, this will be a podcast-style response, so let's jump right into it.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final episode of the Total Liberation podcast. I am sure this is a bit of a surprise, but we'll get into it. And I want to deeply, deeply thank the thousands of people who have stuck by and supported the podcast and who continue to do so. We've cultivated the absolute best community on Discord and elsewhere of just super rad, empathetic, critical thinkers. And I'm so proud of the work that Maureen and I have done and that I continued forward with so many great guests. I was thinking about going to episode 100 and having Nick and Catherine and maybe Maureen back on, but something quite frustrating happened, and I actually recorded this once already. I recorded a super fiery solo final episode while I was out camping about a month ago, and I didn't have time to edit it, so I just was kind of sitting on it, and now, I'm quite a lot calmer. I'm quite a lot calmer. I still feel like there are some very important issues that I'd like to address in this episode, but perhaps in a slightly more compassionate tone. I felt like, I could go out in a fiery blaze of glory, but I don't know. I don't really want that to maybe be the lasting legacy of this podcast. Yeah, and then hopefully after this, I feel like I will have said most of what I wanted to say on this platform and in this particular online space.
It's funny that she was camping when she recorded her original response because I was also camping when this went down, and I was trying so hard to stay off my phone. For those who haven't seen the comments she left on my video, I'll share the thread on screen now so you can pause to read.
But let's get into it. So what happened that had me so incensed and annoyed was someone who had followed me for a very long time, Klein, made a response with a super inflammatory title to the post-veganism episode that Ash and I did, which honestly prior to this got so much support. I actually had people join the Patreon in support after that episode, knowing that it could get some backlash. And a few people who were unfortunately in similar boats to myself and Ash, who felt super seen and supported by the episode, reached out, and we were just both so thrilled to hear that. Like, honestly, like that just makes, that makes our day, honestly, and makes it everything that we said, like, worth it. And so, yeah, I just want to thank those people. I want to thank the people on Discord who were all really awesome, and to all of you who just really appreciated this and really all of our work and our theorizing on this platform. I wanted to say also Nick Pendergast from Freedom of Species also did an episode expanding on our episode. And that was done in just a much, much more respectful manner than Catherine went about it. So we'll get into it. But yeah, Catherine was saying that she wanted to be civil and respectful. First of all, had my face up with, a short caricature of what Ash and I were saying in the thumbnail and calling us woke anti-vegans, and then proceeded to bring up a number of things that are really not okay and really perfect examples of what Ash and I were talking about. And then because of that, I started getting the most wacky emails and messages from people, just like a slew of things. People who clearly did not listen to more than 5 minutes of it and had not considered my points at all, had not actually heard them. And honestly, the ableism and the racism really needs to be addressed. I was thinking of making a video response at first, but response videos have really never been my style. I don't really want to junk up my timeline with a bunch of that, especially since most people aren't actually interested in getting into the weeds of like the he said, she said. But I think it would be more productive for me to make standalone videos on points that were brought up, like the noble savage myth, and on things like disability justice, etc., to make more evergreen content that could inform conversations like this. But as I said, I feel like these things need to be addressed somewhere, so it's going to be here. If you haven't listened to the post-veganism episode that Ash and I put out, you should probably start there. Otherwise, a lot of this will not make sense. And thank you again for the incredible support on that episode. People in the Discord were like, I don't actually see how this is controversial. This seems pretty self-evident. And also, you've been seeing this for years, which is something, again, I'll return to.
Was my title inflammatory? Sure. I will admit, I wanted people to click on the video that I spent hours upon hours making. Expectedly, a few people did not catch the sarcasm. To clarify, I don't think that Mexie and Ash's position is actually woke. It's pseudo-woke. I anticipated that Mexie would take issue with the title especially, which is why I sent her this DM prior to posting it. Again, you can pause to read. I was expecting her to be annoyed by my response, as that is the nature of disagreement. But I was hoping that she would see it as that, a difference of opinion rather than a personal attack. I said in my video that I didn't doubt her sincerity in believing she needed to eat animal products. I doubted the science behind her claims. She is painting my response as horribly harsh when I don't think it was. The short caricature I included in my thumbnail was not a mischaracterization of what they said at all. Ash literally said that veganism, like recycling, is environmental theater. And Mexie said, absolutely, I love that analogy. I think that's spot on. She said in the episode that she was nervous to talk about this because she anticipated backlash, and then said that people joined the Patreon because they knew she would receive backlash and they wanted to counteract that by showing support. Yet in the next breath, she says people in the Discord did not understand how this was controversial. Like, which is it? If you expected backlash, why are you so surprised by it? As for the wacky emails she received, I can't speak to those since she didn't share them, but I can say that anyone who listened to my video most certainly listened to more than 5 minutes of her podcast, as half of my hour-and-a-half long video was long, uninterrupted segments of the episode.
So I have a lot of points to cover, but I think I'll start with some of the highly problematic concepts brought up by Catherine and some people in my emails. The first is that, and this shouldn't be too surprising because I think we all know that there are a lot of, especially white settler vegans, who are not supportive of Indigenous rights or traditional livelihoods at all. But she framed subsistence hunting as only okay if you're living in an environment that is totally inhospitable to growing plant foods, like in the case of the Inuit. And for any other group, it is inherently wrong, and it's actually racist to support Indigenous hunting rights because it's playing into the noble savage trope, valorizing their livelihoods. So, setting aside the fact that there are many environments where it would be difficult to subsist on nothing but local plant foods, if we're not importing things via the global capitalist food system, which is itself highly destructive, please see A Foodie's Guide to Capitalism on that. But all of that aside, this is very important. The noble savage trope is itself a concept that was created by racists. It was coined by racist European anthropologists who were part of the colonial project in order to justify racism and to make people disregard Indigenous knowledge and disrespect their livelihoods. There's a book called The Myth of the Noble Savage by Tur Ellingson that goes over this. I also recommend the book 1491 by Charles Mann that similarly goes over this. I believe David Wengrow and David Graver go over this in The Dawn of Everything. And Seriously Wrong did an excellent podcast episode with David Wengrow that I will link below. And they have an extended section, like a skit on the noble savage trope and its history, which is really fantastic. Love The Wrong Boys. And racists still use this trope today to argue against land back and against giving Indigenous people and their knowledges any authority in conservation practice and other realms. So trying to appeal to this trope in order to say that the real racism is giving a pass, a quote-unquote pass to Indigenous or other subsistence hunters is just a whole big can of worms. I think I will make a video about the noble savage myth because it seems like that would be really productive. It's something that I see brought up a lot. And hopefully it would get mainstream vegans to stop trying to use it to excuse being completely ignorant about Indigenous rights and livelihoods. And yes, of course, as we mentioned, there are Indigenous vegans and there are conversations that are going on in some communities. Great. But as settlers who destroyed Indigenous food systems and forced indigenous people onto reserves, where they were then forced to take up farming, which was considered more civilized, on land that was not suitable for it. I mean, there's a whole terrible history there within a terrible history of colonialism broadly. So to have people in my DMs being like, oh, of course we can make the Inuit go plant-based. I mean, this is just furthering genocide based on quite paternalistic assumptions. And I want to shout out RD, who wrote the chapter called Vegan Washing Genocide, Animal Advocacy on Stolen Land, and Reimagining Animal Liberation as Anti-Colonial Praxis. That is a chapter in the book called Undoing Human Supremacy, which was edited by Simon Springer and others. This was an incredible chapter. It was a scathing critique of white settler veganism, and I'm so glad that it was included in this book. It went over all of the ways that vegans and animal rights activists have been devastating and incredibly colonial in their agitation against Indigenous peoples in so-called Canada, outlining several high-profile cases where already marginalized communities were severely harmed. And I was so happy, again, to see this in this book, because otherwise, a lot of the chapters, I think, fall into the traps of anti-Indigenous rhetoric, which we touched on before, and in our episode about speciesism and defining speciesism in a political way. So I cannot recommend this chapter enough. I'll see if I can link it, but it might be just in the book. And I actually tried to get the author of that chapter on this show, but they are no longer doing any public activism, unfortunately, because they too just got so frustrated with the level of discourse in the mainstream movement, which is sad because they had a lot to contribute. But it's also understandable because here we are.
As a content creator, I completely understand the temptation to just reference a bunch of books and articles and videos, because some things require a lot of context to explain. But as a listener, it's kind of frustrating. Like, I don't have time to do a semester's worth of research. Can you please summarize? I will admit that I was unaware of the history of the noble savage trope. It does appear that Mexie's claim regarding the origin of this concept has legitimacy. According to Wikipedia, there is also a myth of the noble savage. Racist 19th century anthropologists, such as John Crawford, condemned depictions of indigenous peoples as noble savages in the ethnographic record as a straw man. Said anthropologist used this rhetorical tactic to portray indigenous peoples as somehow inherently violent. It makes sense that in the 1800s, depictions of indigenous people as noble were few and far between. But in 2023, it's undeniable that liberals and leftists have a tendency to romanticize indigenous culture. Whether you're implying that indigenous people are inherently violent or inherently noble, you're being racist because indigenous people are people, and no group of people is inherently good or bad. If a vegan activist is specifically targeting indigenous people, that is racist because it sends the message that what indigenous people are doing is uniquely bad. But if they are speaking to a general audience that includes indigenous people, that is not racist because they're holding people of all cultures to the same ethical standard. To be clear, I don't oppose land back. I just oppose unnecessary killing, and I don't think that cultural tradition is a justification for violence. Regarding the Inuit, I've already made my stance clear that killing animals is justifiable when it's done out of necessity. But the climate is changing, and if a plant-based diet becomes viable for them, I don't see how opposing one aspect of their culture on the basis that it involves unnecessary violence is furthering genocide. She says that there are many environments where it would be difficult to subsist off only local plants without importing things via the global capitalist food system. I'm certainly in favor of more localized food systems, but I don't think importing and exporting some foods is inherently destructive. Our global capitalist food system needs to change drastically, but overthrowing capitalism does not entail that we revert back to subsistence living entirely. From my understanding, land back is not about going back to how we lived before colonialism, but rejecting colonial concepts like private property and moving forward with consideration for the environment. It's about acknowledging the treaties that were broken and returning unceded land back to the people it was stolen from. Landback advocates have made it clear that this would not involve forcing non-natives to leave, but to abide by the philosophy of collective responsibility to the land rather than individual ownership of the land. As I said in my original response, I don't see a conflict between veganism and landback. In fact, I think that if we truly apply indigenous ecological principles like reciprocity, we would have to shift to a plant-based food system, because there are simply not enough wild deer or elk or fish to feed the current population. The reason indigenous people were able to hunt and fish sustainably for millennia is because there were so few people.
But getting back to the response and the way that some people have acted, this is really a perfect example of what Ash and I were talking about in the post-vegan episode, because none of the points that we made in that episode were new at all. I have been making these points for years. I made the Why I'm No Longer Vegan TM video almost 5 years ago, and I touched on most of this there. We did the episode with Connie Spence about how our taxes work years ago that shows clearly that these industries are not feeling the losses that they should by people just consuming vegan. We did the speciesism episode years ago about needing to define this in a political and systemic way that, we would argue makes sense and is not liable to be used to further colonial violence. Maureen made these points about veganism needing to be anti-capitalist and political even before we started the podcast together. We started the podcast together because we wanted to advance a definition of veganism, which is a political movement against the commodity status of animals. So none of this is new. Nobody accused us of being anti-vegan for making these same points forever. And honestly, these points we think can only help to benefit the movement if people take them seriously. But if you think that suddenly everything has changed and we're just, Ash and I are just saying what we did to justify our health needs changing, either you haven't been listening to Maureen and I this entire time, and Nicole and Catherine and, everyone that we brought on the podcast, you haven't been listening to us the entire time, or you've been practicing a very ableist form of veganism that just didn't care what we were saying as long as we were able physically to be eating plant-based. The speciesism episode was actually, again, one of the most popular episodes ever, with so many people reaching out and some people, again, joining the Patreon and Discord because they were so happy that content existed. And we had some fantastic talks about it. So, the entire point of starting this podcast together was to make an intervention and to try to advance this political and inclusive vision of total human and animal liberation. Someone who I really appreciate reached out to me on Discord and offered to help me with my response and said that I should address the philosophical definition of veganism, not just the political one. And that's fair. I just don't really know how to address the philosophical definition because our whole thing was trying to advance the political definition, because we believe the philosophical definition of just not eating animals and thinking that all consumption of animals is inherently wrong in all contexts. We thought A, that had a lot of problems, and B, it wouldn't necessarily lead people towards an effective political program for affecting real change. So again, you don't have to agree, I guess, but I think we've put forward some pretty compelling episodes in the last several years. We've done a lot of important work, I think. But yeah, I just had someone rage quit the Discord without even letting me respond, saying that I just conveniently changed my politics to justify taking care of my health issues, which is absolutely untrue. Like, you haven't been listening if you haven't heard us trying to advocate for a political definition of speciesism and veganism for years now.
I have disagreed with some of Mexie's messaging on animal rights in the past. I just didn't feel compelled to comment until now. As a former Patreon supporter, I have seen a lot of her content, but for whatever reason, I missed the episode where they redefined speciesism. That was a wild one. I probably would have responded had I caught it back then. Just because someone eats plant-based doesn't mean they're above criticism. I've made numerous videos calling out pygmy vegans. Mexie is clearly upset that I would insinuate that she is anti-vegan. I already explained that support for veganism is on a spectrum, and I wouldn't place her in the same camp as someone like Piers Morgan. However, anti-vegan accurately describes some of the sentiments expressed in this episode. You can hold racist attitudes without being a card-carrying white supremacist. A lot of TERFs, like Gary Francione for example, sincerely do not believe themselves to be transphobes. I get that we should try to separate people from their beliefs and label attitudes, actions, and rhetoric as racist or transphobic, rather than labeling the person a racist or a transphobe. Part of me wants to say that you can hold certain racist views without necessarily being a racist. But the other part of me just wants to call a spade a spade. You may not be a raging racist, but if you defend racist beliefs, you are a racist on some level. We don't exclusively reserve the label transphobe for people like Matt Walsh, so why should we reserve anti-vegan for people like Pierce Morgan? Mexie did not address this point, which I made in my DM to her, stated clearly in my video, and then reiterated in the comment thread. She just asserts that it's absurd to call her anti-vegan. Also, it really irks me that she continuously argues my position is apolitical. She says Maureen made these points about veganism needing to be anti-capitalist and political before we started the podcast, and we started the podcast to advance the idea that veganism is a political movement against the commodity status of animals. As if this isn't my stance. I have multiple videos outlining why veganism is political, one titled Why Veganism is Political, and another responding to the vegan bros titled Veganism is Inherently Political. This is literally the theme of my channel. Outside of YouTube, I'm working on a political campaign to ban fur and slaughterhouses, which I mentioned in my original video. You can disagree with my position, but you can't say that it's apolitical. Her distinction between the political and philosophical definition of veganism makes no sense. Politics are derived from philosophy. The philosophy of veganism is inherently political. The philosophical definition she provides, that all consumption of animals is inherently wrong in all contexts, is the biggest strawman I've ever heard. The most commonly cited definition of veganism is from the Vegan Society, a philosophy and way of living which seeks to exclude, as far as possible and practicable, all forms of exploitation of and cruelty to animals for food, clothing, or any other purpose. Virtually all vegans acknowledge that it's not wrong to consume animal products in contexts where it's not possible or practicable to avoid doing so.
I also want to briefly address the concept of carnism, because Catherine said that my points reinforced carnism, or the idea that eating meat is necessary, natural, or normal. I will get back to the necessary for whom bit later, but what myself and the regular members of this podcast have come to, especially in our speciesism episode, is that this to us is not a terribly helpful concept. The creator of it has also said that it is now used in ways that she never intended it to be used. It's used often as a slur against anyone who consumes animals anywhere. Speciesism is a super useful concept if you're defining it in a systemic way, which we've covered. Carnism, though, can get into some pretty problematic territory, similar to an apolitical definition of speciesism. And I understand the appeal of it. When I first heard it and hadn't really critically thought about it, I definitely ascribed to it. And I would go around sharing that animated video about carnism anywhere, like, wow, check this out. And I think that it is actually useful. To give it credit, I think that it is useful to get people to consider why some animals are treated so luxuriously, like our pets and some exotic animals, but other animals we deem it okay to cage and torture and breed for specific traits that make them sick and just all the rest of it. So that part is useful. The problem is that it falls apart outside of a largely Western capitalist context. And I think trying to argue that meat eating isn't natural or sometimes necessary is honestly a fool's errand and ultimately not necessary to build a movement to end animal agriculture. There are so many cultures, for example, the Inuit that Catherine brought up, that couldn't possibly have lived in their environments for thousands of years without eating animals. And even before the advent of the hugely damaging globalized food systems we have now, there were still many places that were, hospitable to growing plants that still would have been extremely difficult for people to be okay and fully, nourished and healthy being fully plant-based. So outside of a few anomalies, most indigenous cultures globally ate animals and involved eating them. And what could be more natural than existing sustainably in your ecosystem for millennia? What is not natural is the entire global edifice of animal agriculture. What is not normal is keeping billions of animals caged as living commodities and breeding them for specific traits. Nothing about what we're doing under colonial capitalism is natural or normal or acceptable. And you don't have to argue that anyone who eats animals is a carnist, framing them often as the enemy. But even if you're trying to stay neutral, framing them as somebody who is just deluded by ideology, which, as we mentioned with many cultures, is often racist. But it would be far more productive and realistic and effective to just say, hey, this global industry is insupportable and it's unsustainable, and so it needs to end. So anyway, with this quite one-dimensional and not materialist understanding of carnism as just, anyone who eats an animal is a carnist and is deluded into doing so by oppressive ideology, I know if only these deluded carnists would just learn the evilness of their ways. I just find it so unhelpful, often deeply colonizing, and just really rudimentary theorizing, frankly.
Since Mexie seems to think that the only reason I'm criticizing her is because she stopped eating plant-based, I would like to point out that I have a video critiquing Melanie Joy, the psychologist who coined the term carnism, for her apologism. To say that carnist is a slur is as laughable as claiming turf is a slur. I mean, technically, any term that is used pejoratively is a slur in the general sense. This includes words like bigot, Nazi, and homophobe. But when we think of the word slur, what immediately comes to mind is hate speech. The N-word, the R-word, the F-slur, the T-slur. Obviously, Mexie is not arguing that the word carnist is so vile that it shouldn't be uttered, but what is implied when she says carnist is a slur is that vegans shouldn't use this term to describe people who eat animals because it's derogatory. As David also points out in his Medium article, bigot is a slur. Of course it's derogatory to call someone a bigot, because a bigot is a bad thing to be, and it's not wrong or hateful to point that out. Just stop being a bigot. Claiming that bigot is a slur is simply a dishonest tactic of bigots to evade responsibility and claim victim status. Again, I recognize that Mexie is not equating the word carnist with actual hate speech, but I doubt she would tell a trans rights advocate that they shouldn't call people TERFs because it's offensive to TERFs. Mexie says arguing that meat isn't natural or sometimes necessary is a fool's errand. This is another straw man. Melanie Joy's three ends of justification, that eating meat is normal, natural, and necessary, apply to modern society. These are the reasons people who live in modern society give to justify their meat consumption. They appeal to popularity, arguing that it's normal. They appeal to nature, arguing that it's natural. And they appeal to pseudoscience, arguing that it's necessary. Whether something is normal or natural is not relevant when it comes to ethics, but whether something is necessary is. Of course, historically, eating animals was necessary, and in some present-day contexts, it still is. But is it necessary for people like Mexie to eat animals? That is where our fundamental disagreement lies. She says this concept falls apart outside of a Western capitalist context. No, it doesn't. It is possible and practicable to eat plant-based outside of Western capitalist countries. Capitalism may be the cause of many of society's ills, but it's not the root of all evil. If we overthrew capitalism tomorrow, we'd still have carnism. Anyone who eats animals outside of a survival context is doing so because they have been indoctrinated by carnist ideology. And yes, this makes them an enemy to the animals. Mexie says this view is racist. I would love for her to define racism and explain exactly how this is racist.
Catherine said that she's involved with a ballot measure to ban slaughterhouses in Denver. That's fantastic. That's excellent. But she's like, well, if you're going to do that, then you should be able to, at the very least, consume totally plant-based. Like, why? And for 5 years, we've been talking about how there are innumerable reasons why somebody might not be able to, or maybe they're like 90% there, but they are unable to get to 100%. But they can still care enough to be part of a broader movement that's actually taking action against the industry, right? Like, there's not actually a reason why you couldn't be involved in this organizing without being 100% there. This is truly just policing your comrades, right? Like, it really is.
As an organizer, I would never tell someone they can't participate in our ballot initiative unless they're vegan. If someone cares enough to show up and is willing to do the work, I'd accept their help. but I'm not going to condone their consumption of animal products. Their behavior, eating animals, is what is not welcome in this space. My point was that these people in Mexie's mind don't actually exist. Sure, there's the occasional non-vegan who shows up for one canvassing shift, and again, I appreciate their help. But the regular volunteers and organizers are all vegan, because the only people who care enough to put in sustained effort for the animals are vegans. There's policing your comrades, and then there's bending over backwards to make excuses for them. Personally, I'm in favor of the Goldilocks zone, which is holding your comrades to reasonable standards. Mexie's language shows just how much of an excuse maker she is. There are innumerable reasons why some people might not be able to be vegan.
And re-carnism, I similarly lived with a Karen tribe in the highland forest of northern Thailand for my master's and PhD work. And every family had chickens, pigs, often oxen. Chickens just roamed free throughout the village. Cows would just roam around the mountaintops. Like you'd go on a hike and you'd run into like some random animals up there. And these people do not participate in animal agriculture. They also do not participate in industrial plant agriculture, which is awesome because in A Foodist Guide to Capitalism, again, it shows how destructive industrial plant agriculture is to our soils, to our pollinators, to people, and to animals. I mean, I made the point in my Why I'm No Longer Vegan TM video about almonds and bees, and how vegans will yell at people for eating honey or be like, oh my God, somebody will post something innocently in a vegan group like, oh, is honey vegan? Everyone will be like, no, like you idiot, just completely come down on them. Meanwhile, they're like drinking back all of this almond milk that was made in California by shipping around hundreds of thousands of bees who are being, kept in captivity. They're sick. They're feeding on things that are making them ill. They're dying, but that's vegan, right? This is the point, right? This is the point about needing to understand the systemic nature of the problem so that you can actually address it. You can actually move forward and find appropriate solutions and not just think like, oh, I'm solving the problem by consuming this almond milk instead of this dairy milk, when the way that it was produced is equally damaging.
Classic appeal to hypocrisy. If vegans are concerned about harm to bees, perhaps we should consider drinking oat or soy milk over almond milk. But that's not the point she's making. She's not saying drink oat milk instead. She's making an appeal to hypocrisy to justify her consumption of animal products. To then equate almond milk to dairy milk is insane. In terms of land use, water use, and emissions, dairy milk is far more destructive than almond milk. It sounds like Mexie is closer to Piers Morgan on the anti-vegan spectrum than I thought. Mexie glamorizes the lifestyle of this tribe in Thailand, as if this model can be extrapolated to feed a population of 8 billion people and counting. The amount of land required to raise free-range animals is astronomical compared to the amount of land required to operate a CAFO. And the number of people who believe they need animal products to be healthy far exceeds the number of people who could sustainably consume them.
Anyway, I also have a good friend who used to be in the Discord who lives in the country, and he and his partner basically homestead. They have an incredible property that they've allowed to grow into super generative habitat for many wild animals. They grow most of their own food. They have backyard chickens. They fish in the nearby river. They hunt, and they eat roadkill, actually, so animals who have already passed away in another way, and they feel like, why waste their bodies? And I agree with that. So they are not participating in purchasing from the animal agriculture industry. They are very self-sufficient, but a mainstream vegan person would probably go up to them and call them murderers, carnists, and speciesists, and they shouldn't be living that way. They obviously have a completely different experience and understanding. And this is why we've also said that this kind of apolitical vegan stance we feel is very suburban and urban in nature. It's really disconnected from the way that a lot of people in the world actually live. And people will say that, oh, that's supremacist, that's human supremacy, that's oppression. And I guess there is an argument to be made there about the backyard chickens, because although there is some symbiosis, you own the chickens. So it's not like they're necessarily there of their own free will. But, for the fishing and the hunting, people will still say oh, but that's human supremacy, that's oppression. But we know that existing in food webs is not supremacist. Everyone will go out there leftists at least, will go out there and argue against Jordan Peterson and the Jordan Petersons of the world and their ideas about natural hierarchies in nature. Because there are no hierarchies in food webs. There are no hierarchies in nature. We know this. A predator animal is not above their prey animal. A predator animal is not oppressing their prey animals. But people will say that anyone eating an animal in any context is carnist and speciesist, and it's oppression. Now, the industry of animal agriculture absolutely is rooted in human supremacy and white supremacy. There's great theory on that. But not everyone has to not eat animals to be against that industry, right? And again, we talked about colonialism in depth in the post-veganism episode. And indeed, people like my friend that I spoke about are not even participating in purchasing from that industry. And surely, absolutely, they would mobilize with people who are working to shut down factory farms. But vegans would be so incensed by their livelihoods that they just could not wrap their minds around organizing with people like that. And same with myself. I mean, I have been in the movement for 20 years, I obviously care about this. I have had to make changes due to my health concerns, but I'm telling people publicly, I am still absolutely 100% down to help organize against these industries. And I'll get back into it later, but, I don't actually purchase from those industries at this point where I'm living now in the country. But there are still so many people. I mean, there's tons of people, even just on Catherine's response video, leaving ridiculous comments about how they just always knew that I'm an evil person. And they would just never organize with me because I've had to address my ability needs. I mean, how fucking ridiculous is that? And this is why we feel that the political definition is so important, because the philosophical definition leaves a lot to be desired. Someone also threw out the line that you cannot be for animal liberation or rights and eat animals. And again, this is something that sounds really good. If you don't actually think about it in any context outside of capitalist suburbia. But the people in so-called Canada who are doing the most to protect animals, animal rights, are Indigenous peoples on the front lines of land defense against toxic industries. I work with communities setting up Indigenous protected and conserved areas and protecting animals and caring for the health of their populations free in the wild. This is what underpins most of these efforts, but they still eat animals. Actually, the INI initiative, which is an incredible collaborative effort of about 30 different nations across the US and Canada, they are working to restore buffalo, free-roaming buffalo, back to the plains across a super vast area. And those animals would be free. There's a lot of people working to help them live well because they have such a deep connection and appreciation for them. But part of that initiative is also so that the tribes can again engage in sustainable hunting and reestablish that relationship that was severed through colonialism, which destroyed their food security and their culture. People outside of that community living in the suburbs cannot really even imagine having a relationship like that goes back so many generations. So from that subject position, like a suburban capitalist kind of subject position, it becomes really easy to point fingers. And, these are just, I think, quite simplistic lines that people throw out, and they don't actually hold up under much scrutiny. Like Catherine actually said, well, how could an animal get an arrow in the back and be liberated? How could that be liberation? And I know, I've been vegan forever. I know that it's cliche that people will bring up other animals eating animals, but truly, would you say that a prey animal that is torn to shreds in the jaws of another animal, probably the most violent way to die? Well, I mean, I guess animal agriculture, the industry is extremely violent and horrific. However, would you say that that animal who met that end were not liberated because that's the way that they died? They weren't being caged, they weren't being bred, they weren't being tortured, they were free, and they ended up meeting a pretty gruesome and horrific end at the hands of a predator animal. So what, they weren't liberated? What does liberation mean to you? I had someone say that they were just so upset knowing that some animals had died for, anyone to consume them. And yes, that's very upsetting. And it would be ideal if no animal ever had to die or meet their demise at the hands of another animal and end up as food. That would be great. But if I were to really mourn all of the prey animals who die in the world, I mean, that is just truly too much to take on. Like, that's just how food webs work. Nothing about that means that the animal agriculture industry is fine. I mean, it's totally unnatural. It is caging animals. It is killing them in unconscionable ways. It is torturing them by the billions. So that, of course, we can stop. Of course, we should stop that. But the point is that is a system. Like, this is the system that is the enemy, not necessarily the fact that, like, any animal is dying or being eaten in the world. So liberation is liberation from colonial capitalism, from this entire global edifice that is killing animals, oppressing humans, oppressing animals, and killing our planet, right? Like, it's causing global ecocide. These are the oppressive systems that we are up against. People participating in their food webs, I don't see as being akin to oppression or, not liberation. And the argument from apolitical vegans is, oh, but humans should know better and then choose better, which is itself elevating humans above other animals. Like, all other omnivores who still eat other animals within food webs just aren't able to reason like we can. So when they eat animals alive in their jaws, it's not sad. It's just normal. But when we eat animals, it's not normal or natural. It's actually oppression. That argument gets super dicey in a lot of scenarios. And I know that the people who are listening to this get that, unless you're just like hate listening to the episode to make more response videos. But I know that Marina and I, Nicole and Catherine, we've cultivated a really great community. And I know that there are so many radical vegan agitators that know all this and who agree and who define harm systemically and have a really robust understanding of what's going on in the world. And we've always had our differences with the mainstream rhetoric, which is fine. We've done our best to advocate, for a broader understanding, and we'll continue to agitate in all the ways that we can. I just think that this is really important to bring up because having apolitical understandings of veganism, speciesism, and carnism is what can lead people to do things like try to employ the noble savage trope to argue against respecting the treaties, and to be terribly insensitive and ableist to people who can't sustain this mode of consumption. And of course, if we abolish the industry, it would mean that most people would radically reduce their consumption, if not eliminate it completely. But I can honestly see a world where that happens and then white vegans are just coming hard for disabled people and subsistence hunters and just being absurd about it.
This is the most condescending shit I've ever heard. My friends and I have a very robust understanding of what's going on in the world, and you clearly don't. You city folk are so disconnected from reality. Fucking white people, am I right? Anyway, Mexie is defining oppression and liberation in a narrow way. Broadly speaking, oppression is an unjust exercise of power. You don't have to be caged or enslaved to be oppressed. A gazelle is oppressed not by the lion, who kills to survive, but by Mother Nature, who is cruel and unfair and exerts her power over us. Can animals be liberated from all forms of oppression? No. But they can be liberated from human oppression. Obviously, we can't control nature, but we can fight to end the systems of oppression that we created. If a human in northern Canada hunts to survive, they're not oppressing their prey, as they have a justifiable reason to kill. This is not human supremacy. This is the food web. However, outside the context of survival, hunting is unjustifiable. This is not the food web. This is an act of human supremacy. So no, a deer is not liberated from human supremacy if they get an arrow in the back from a human who hunts to preserve a particular cultural tradition. She flips the script when she says the argument that humans know better, so we should choose better, is elevating humans above animals. First of all, we're not saying non-human animals are incapable of moral reasoning. We're saying they don't possess scientific knowledge. Humans are far more technologically advanced, and therefore we have mountains of scientific data showing that we can survive and thrive without consuming animal products. This informs our moral decision-making. And second, acknowledging that humans have more advanced reasoning capacities does not imply that we are superior in terms of moral worth. Only an ableist would interpret it that way, or someone performing mental gymnastics. She follows that up with, these other animals aren't able to reason like we can, so when they eat animals, it's not sad, it's just normal. But when we do it, it's oppression. No one said it's not sad to watch a lion rip apart a gazelle. You literally just read a comment from a vegan about how sad it is that animals have to die in this way. No one is expecting you to mourn all the deaths that take place in the world. Of course that is too much to take on. We're only asking that you not add to the death count. Lastly, she says if we abolish this industry, it would mean that most people would radically reduce their consumption, if not eliminate it completely. But I can see a world where that happens, and then white vegans are coming hard for disabled people and subsistence hunters, and being absurd about it. This conflicts with her narrative that there are innumerable reasons people can't be plant-based, and you're not the arbiter of what's necessary for someone else. Many people will convince themselves that they fall into this category. And yes, vegans will still take issue with animal slaughter in this context, as abolishing factory farming has never been the end goal of animal liberation activists.
And yeah, I was vegan for so long, I too repeated ad nauseum that a vegan diet is healthful and appropriate for everyone in every stage of their life, which can be, but I have now learned that there's a hell of a lot more to it than that. I talked about in that episode the people that I was very shitty to who told me that they couldn't go vegan because of their specific medical conditions. And because I had watched Forks Over Knives, which by the way was like debunked by a recent maintenance phase episode. And I was like, wow. I mean, it's actually wild what I believed without actually looking into it at all. And they go into I believe they go into the China study, which like, again, like, wow. I honestly, yeah, it's like embarrassing as an academic it's like I just took these things and just internalized them I didn't even look at the study. I didn't even go to the source material to look at it. I was like, oh, somebody told me that the China study says that eating animal protein is bad and it leads to heart disease and diabetes and cancer. I mean, yeah, wow. But yeah, I mean, I actually, for a time, believed that plant-based diets are the healthiest and that they can cure everything. But, that's what I had internalized from the movement. And I recently looked up the conditions of the people I was talking about. And I was like, oh shit, yeah, this person cannot handle that much fiber. This person cannot handle that many oxalates. This person is not able to metabolize nutrients from these sources. And I have since issued apologies to people that I was insensitive to, after they professed that they could not begin a plant-based diet or who had to stop.
I literally fucking cackled when she referenced the Maintenance Phase podcast as her source. This is a fat acceptance podcast that downplays the negative health effects of obesity and makes claims such as obesity is a slur and the BMI is racist. I understand that fat people are marginalized. It's important to discuss the harms of weight stigma and toxic diet culture. But you know what else harms fat people? Telling them comforting lies. One of the show's hosts, Michael Hobbs, wrote a viral piece in HuffPost titled, "Everything You Know About Obesity is Wrong." In other words, scientific consensus, schmientific consensus. I read the article, and it's basically a compilation of accounts of people saying awful things to fat people. It honestly would have been a great article without such an outrageous title and dangerously inaccurate statements such as this. Keeping weight off means fighting your body's energy regulation system and battling hunger all day, every day, for the rest of your life. It's no wonder that the hosts take issue with the messaging in Forks Over Knives, which is to forget about calorie counting and portion control. Just eat whole plant foods until you feel satiated and the weight will come off. The film very much conveys that sustained weight loss is possible without battling hunger all day, every day for the rest of your life. There are no doubt claims made in Forks Over Knives that are inaccurate, for example, that dairy leaches calcium from the bones. But they fail to debunk the central thesis of the film, which is that animal products and processed foods cause heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. They completely misrepresent the film, saying that it explicitly says that a vegan diet will prevent and reverse all forms of chronic disease. It does not say this. Mexie says, "I just believed that eating animal protein causes heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, and that she's embarrassed that as an academic, she didn't go to the source material." Yet her source is the Maintenance Phase podcast. That is embarrassing. I wonder what source told her that some people can only metabolize certain nutrients from animal sources. I doubt she read the original source material. While I consider myself a bit of a nutrition nerd, I'm not going to pretend that I'm out here poring over the source material myself. Admittedly, I don't know how to read a forest plot. What I do is I make sure the people I'm listening to are citing primary source material, and then I look at the crossover between what various experts are saying. What seems to be the scientific consensus? Plant-based health gurus make claims that I personally find compelling, for example, that dairy causes breast and prostate cancer. But since this doesn't appear to be the scientific consensus, I'm not going to proclaim that it's true. However, all of the leading nutrition organizations, such as the World Health Organization and the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, recommend a diet centered around fruits, vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and seeds, and to limit saturated fat and refined sugar. And many explicitly state that a well-planned vegan diet is nutritionally adequate for humans at all stages of life. Meat and dairy products are the primary source of saturated fat in Western diets, and saturated fat is known to cause plaque buildup in your arteries and insulin resistance. Processed meat, meaning animal flesh, including fish, that is salted, smoked, or cured, is a Class 1 carcinogen. Red meat is listed as a probable carcinogen. Even if you choose unprocessed, lean, white meat and low-fat dairy, eating animal products has an opportunity cost. Animal products crowd out space for antioxidant-rich whole plant foods. And health outcome data supports our mechanistic understandings. Vegans have lower rates of heart disease, diabetes, and cancer. Mexie no longer believes that animal products cause heart disease, diabetes, and cancer, which means her beliefs no longer align with the scientific consensus. And lastly, regarding fiber and oxalates, it is possible to lower your intake of these things on a vegan diet. A vegan diet encompasses a huge variety of foods.
But what really upset me, though, was the insinuation that I had not exhausted all of my medical options before making the decision to incorporate animal products again, after nearly 20 years, by the way. Ash has also been vegan for over 20 years. And people are acting like we just never cared, we were just lying, we just don't know what veganism is about, we're not divulging enough about our situations. And some of my situation was actually very private. I divulged a small part of it on a comment on the response. But it's honestly quite disgusting that people are being raked through the coals like this and having to prove that they're sick enough and prove that they tried hard enough and prove that they went to the right specialist. Like, I had someone leave the most hysterical comment. I don't like using that word, but hysterical comment saying that I didn't go to a vegan specialist or I didn't try to fix this on a vegan diet. And I'm like, sorry, sir, do you know me? Like, it is so wild that people will make public comments like that to strangers. Like, how do you know what I tried? How do you fucking know that? Like, you think that's being supremely ill for nearly a decade, I didn't try everything? I mean, it came out because this person was like, oh, don't you know that we're all actually herbivores? So it's like, that's it. Like, if you're under the impression that this is just natural and like the most healthy way for every single body on the planet to live, then you're gonna come at people and be like, oh, well, you didn't do this, even though you don't know what they did. You have no fucking clue. Like, you do not know shit about me. I spent years and years and years, about a decade, suffering with my chronic illness and autoimmune condition. I struggled with insomnia, daily pain, chronic migraines that often had me hospitalized and losing work for months at a time. My hormones were a complete mess. My blood sugar was a mess so that I could not sleep through the night without getting up multiple times to eat and pee. Major signs of blood sugar and insulin disruption. Insulin being a hormone as well. I often had a headache when I would wake up. It was a fucking slog. I went like 4 years without watching a single television show because I didn't have the spoons or capacity to look at screens. And for a very long time, I would have to spend every day after work lying in bed with the lights off and my ice hat on, just doing fucking nothing, or like listening to a podcast or just going to bed at like 8. One of my relationships disintegrated because of it. And I mean, thank God, because that person was not supportive or for me at all. But it was still really painful and I was depressed as hell. I mean, I invite anyone listening to this to even try living like that for even 1 month and tell me how your will to live is. And I, of course, tried. Why would I just sit there not trying everything? I mean, years. I went to different specialist after specialist. I worked with a bunch of experts to try and solve things on a plant-based diet. I probably did this for way longer than was good for me because I didn't want to consider changing my diet. I didn't even consider that that might be helpful for me because I had internalized that this was the best, healthiest diet for everyone, and that eating animals and animal products was actually bad. So of course it couldn't be that. It couldn't be the diet. And even if it might be, I just refused to change. So I tried everything I could. Didn't really work out. And Catherine actually said, oh, but I wanted a home birth. So I didn't exhaust my medical options when it came to my platelets plummeting, which, I mean, was a later thing. So anyway, but I was also like, well, surely nobody, you'd have to be a monster to say anything about that urgent platelet situation. So let me be clear. My option was to let my platelets keep plummeting. I also had low red blood count and low iron. So let that keep happening and be at risk of, getting a cut, admit myself to the hospital and hope they could inject me with a bunch of stuff to save me through childbirth. Like there's already a huge risk of hemorrhaging in childbirth. And then if you have extremely low platelets, it's way worse. I actually was admitted to the hospital overnight because I was bleeding so profusely. So do you hear yourself? How low is it to just casually conjecture about someone's health and life? That is fucking appalling.
Mexie is presenting a false dichotomy to paint me as a monster. Please explain how your only option was to eat animal flesh, otherwise you'd risk bleeding out during childbirth. Where is the science that supports this claim, or any of your claims? How does animal flesh cure insomnia or insulin resistance? I didn't ask you to divulge that you had a miscarriage. You brought that up as an appeal to emotion. I'm not trying to pry into your personal life. I'm questioning scientific claims you made on your public platform.
So I want to underscore how dangerous and damaging it is that vegans constantly tell people not to listen to their caregivers, not to listen to their doctors. I probably repeated this to people, and I am so sorry that I did. Don't listen to your doctor, right? Because they don't know what they're talking about. They don't take classes in nutrition. They don't know all the research. Just go out and find someone who will tell you what you want to hear and work with you the way that you want to work. And I did that. Actually, myself and two close friends who were all suffering with fairly similar issues did that. I had a friend who was a vegan nutritionist, so of course I started there. Because I had so many intertwining issues, I was being sent to specialists of all kinds, neurologists, endocrinologists, and other hormone specialists. And, most specialists that you work with, especially for hormonal issues, if they are talking about diet at all, will recommend similar things, which is not based on nothing.
She's trying to portray vegans like myself as conspiratorial psychos who distrust all medical professionals. Personally, I wouldn't tell someone to ignore the advice of their doctor, but to use discernment. It's a fact that many doctors aren't properly trained in nutrition. Not very long ago, doctors were recommending cigarettes and red wine to their patients. She says she saw all kinds of specialists, and they recommended similar things. What exactly did they recommend?
People are like, oh, you didn't get into the science. Do you want me to?
Yes, please cite your sources.
That was not at all the direction that Ash and I wanted to take in that episode. I mean, this is a political show. It's not we don't talk about health often. We don't talk about consumption. We talk about politics. We didn't want our last episode to just be like a scientific, my God, that would certainly be read as anti-vegan by people who think that veganism is this philosophical definition of veganism.
Science is inherently intertwined with politics. Climate change, vaccines, these are political topics. Imagine someone saying climate change is a hoax, and then when asked to back up their claims with scientific evidence, they say, this is a podcast about politics, not science.
But Catherine was like, well, what are these magical properties in eggs and fish that are important for hormonal issues? Do you want me to tell you? I actually now know a lot about this. And yes, you can get these things from plant-based sources. The problem is that many, if not most, human bodies are very inefficient at converting them from plant-based sources. In my 20s, for example, I was extremely anemic and I had to start supplementation because my body just could not metabolize iron from plant-based sources, or it was just very inefficient at doing so. And thinking back on it now, I'm sure that those supplements weren't actually vegan because the whole problem was that I was having a hard time getting it from plant-based sources. So not all bodies are the same.
She's saying not all bodies are the same to support the claim that some people require animal products. But this is not a supporting argument, it's a rhetorical trick. It's a Mott and Bailey fallacy. I'll flash a visual on screen if you're unfamiliar with this concept. The Mott is an obvious, uncontroversial statement that is easy to defend. The Bailey is a bold, controversial statement that is difficult to defend. People will make a bold, controversial claim, and then when pressed to defend it, they retreat to the Mott. In this case, not all bodies are the same is the Mott. Many, if not most, human bodies are inefficient at converting certain nutrients from plant-based sources, is the Bailey. I accept that not all bodies are the same. No one specific diet is right for everyone. There are many ways to tailor a vegan diet to your specific needs. And note that she says many, if not most, human bodies. This directly contradicts what she said earlier, that abolishing the animal ag industry would mean that most people would have to radically reduce their consumption, if not eliminate it completely. If many, if not most people need animal products, we cannot abolish the animal agriculture industry. Traditional hunting and fishing cannot support billions of people. There isn't enough land.
But most specialists who are successful will recommend similar things. They don't force you to do anything, so you can say, no, I don't want to go that route. I want to heal this on a plant-based diet. And so myself and my friends were doing that. My one friend had not had her period in like 7 years, and people kept saying like, oh, you just had PCOS, so that's just how it is. Don't worry about it until you want to get pregnant because then it's an issue. Some vegans actually say, oh, well, didn't you know that your period is actually a sign of toxicity? And so if you're not getting it or if it's super irregular, that's actually great.
Your friend's doctor sounds like an idiot, and I don't know a single vegan who believes it's healthy to lose your period. Why are you bringing this up? Oh, right, to portray vegans as lunatics.
She also had an autoimmune condition with her thyroid, so very elevated antibodies like I had. For years, she was just going for it, trying to figure it out. Didn't get very far. And then she began listening to her caregiver, but was like, I want to limit this. So she went like half in. Again, like got a little bit further, but not too far. Finally decided to just take the advice of her caregiver. She has now had her period back consistently every month for a year now, and her autoimmune condition is in remission. She is very, very clear that this was the thing. This was the thing that changed, that finally made the difference. And based on her success, I decided to work with this specialist and do a very deep dive into my hormonal state, which is a complete mess. No other specialist had worked with me so closely. And like I said, I used to have antibodies near 200 when they're supposed to be under 30. And now they're in the normal range. And everything I just described before, I'm basically no longer dealing with any of it. So can you just sit with that for a minute? Like the immensity of that. And how much my life has changed. And people in the comments were like, oh, this isn't science, this is just vibes. No, my blood work isn't just vibes, guys. How is that just vibes? My antibodies are in the normal range for the first time in 10 years. My blood sugar, which I now monitor more regularly, is far more balanced. I sleep wonderfully now without having to get up. I don't have to take sleeping pills. I don't have to get up and eat and pee a million times. I haven't had a migraine in a year, when I used to get multiple per week. And people are like, well, I'm so disappointed. Like, you're disappointed that I don't have an autoimmune condition anymore? Because you weren't disappointed with my points, or you didn't say you were, disappointed with my points publicly when I was plant-based. Maybe you even supported me on Patreon. And now that I'm not, you have to disavow me and discredit my experience, saying you just don't believe that it was necessary after 20 years. And like, based on what? Based on fucking what? Isn't the fact that I did heal an indicator that, oh yeah, that probably was necessary for her? I mean, same with my friend, like that clearly was necessary for her.
I'm not discrediting her experience. I don't doubt that she struggled with various health problems associated with her autoimmune condition, and that she's now doing much better. I'm not even claiming that her dietary change played no part in her recovery. What I'm doubtful of is the scientific claim that eating animal flesh was the only solution for her. She says, isn't the fact that I did heal an indicator that, oh yeah, this probably was necessary? No, it's not. That's not how science works. Personal anecdotes do not qualify as scientific evidence. I understand why some people withdrew their Patreon support after she announced she was no longer vegan. But I just want to state for the record that I did not immediately pull my Patreon support. I didn't disavow her in my video. I expressed disagreement with her. It wasn't her change in diet, it was her insanely defensive and hostile response that made me say, bye bitch. I mean, look at the way she twists people's words. People are saying they're disappointed. Like, you're disappointed that I don't have an autoimmune condition anymore? Yeah, that's clearly it. We want you to suffer from chronic pain, just as we wanted you to bleed out during childbirth. Also, she keeps implying that she was vegan for 20 years. She was vegetarian for the majority of those years. Stop conflating veganism with vegetarianism. Regardless, it doesn't matter how long you've been vegan. Where is the data to support your claims?
And her caregiver, this hormone specialist, wasn't recommending this stuff out of nowhere. She's recommending it because she knows the science and she knows the data of all the people she's worked with. My God.
Show us the science.
I mean, people just hold on to this apolitical conception of social change and of speciesism, and so they can't reckon with or accept that there are some people with different ability needs. They want all humans in every context to never eat animals. Not just for the animal agriculture industry and systemic oppression to end, they want no human to ever eat animals and ever need to eat animals. So it makes sense, if that's what you want, if that's your ideology, to put out into the world that actually this is the best for everyone and that we're all innately herbivores. Because if that's not true, actually, then your apolitical vision of a vegan world can't be realized.
Again, please explain how my position is apolitical.
So returning to people asking about the science, my other friend who I mentioned had similar issues to mine, plus fibromyalgia, and was also pre-diabetic. Similarly, made a miraculous recovery after finally listening to her caregivers. And she was so pissed off that she stayed so sick for so long because she felt gaslit by people telling her that she totally could heal without changing her diet and that that definitely wasn't the thing. And she did a super deep dive into all the scientific literature from all camps, from all diets. So, message me if you're struggling. I can connect you. But she's actually going to do a series about it eventually and share this information. Again, I didn't care to go into all of it here because, like I said, my goal was never to dissuade people from eating plant-based. If that works for you, that's amazing. We underscored that in our episode. So that's just not where we wanted to take the episode. It's not where I want to take things now.
Ah, her other friend knows the science. Case closed. She says she doesn't want to get into the science because she doesn't want to dissuade people from eating plant-based. But being vague does exactly that. If only a small subset of people with a specific set of conditions require animal products, it's better to explain what those conditions are. Otherwise, people with all sorts of conditions are going to think this applies to them too.
So the fact that Catherine supported me on Patreon this whole time and didn't care until now just proves the point that, as long as you can meet that bar of consumption, you're good. And if you can't, you're immoral and fuck you. And you must be disavowed and your experience must be wrong. You must be wrong. Your specialist must be wrong. You should have been able to do this a different way and whatever. I mean, she actually said, well, I guess we just have different morals. And that's it. I mean, people use this as a way to feel morally superior just because they're in a body that can do this longer term where some others cannot. And she said she didn't want to burn a bridge. Listen to not burning bridges. Don't put someone's face up with an inflammatory title and judge them for not doing enough. And love comments of people leaving, just heinous and belittling things about not believing me and thinking that I was actually always just a terrible, immoral person. Just in case any of you listeners were planning on trying to not burn bridges that way, she was like, oh, but I used a flattering picture of you. My God.
Mexie is very upset that I stopped giving her money on Patreon. She says this proves the point that vegans see things in black and white. Vegans are moral and non-vegans are immoral. This is bullshit. I personally do not require that everyone I financially support must be vegan. I give money to homeless people knowing they'll probably buy animal products with it. I don't believe that vegans are good people worthy of support, and non-vegans are bad people not worthy of support. Mexie's hypocrisy is glaring when she says that vegans police others to feel morally superior, while she judges and shames vegans for our supposed toxicity and ableism. Calling vegans self-righteous is a thought-terminating cliche. And the reason I said I guess we have different morals is because you freaked the fuck out that I put your face in my thumbnail. Like, how egregious. Mexie kills animals. I make targeted response videos. Shame on me, right?
Catherine actually brought up that Ash and I were not plant-based currently at the very start of her response episode, saying that the points that we made were just, justifying healing ourselves, as if we were just biding our time to eat animals again. So let me say clearly, I did not find being vegan difficult at all. I just did not find it challenging. My autism also helped, I think, because I have often very black and white thinking. And when I commit to something and choose it, that's it. Like, the decision has been made. I didn't struggle. I didn't miss animal products. I really did not. And if you know me, you know that it's more difficult for me to do an easier thing if I'm not aligned with it. Like, the harder thing for me to do was to move away from this thing that I was committed to. That was the harder thing. And why would I choose that, especially with the platform that I have, if it didn't actually help me so immensely? Like, people honestly don't think. They just immediately jump to disavowing because they have to, because they're operating with this completely apolitical, like, idealist understanding of veganism and social change and everything. So it's like, I must be wrong. Right? I must be. Because if I'm not wrong, then I just, I'm invalidating the movement.
I brought up the fact that you weren't vegan at the beginning to spare people the confusion that I endured listening to the first 3/4 of the episode. And I didn't doubt your sincerity. I never suggested that you simply wanted to eat animals again because you missed the taste and used this as a convenient excuse. I still believe that you believe this is necessary. What I doubt is your scientific claims. And for the love of God, tell me how my understanding of veganism and social change is apolitical.
However, a political movement against the commodity status of animals, let's say tomorrow, like a scientific breakthrough happens and, it's clear beyond a doubt that people need to eat animals and animal products. This is just, for the sake of argument. Let's say that happened. A political movement against the commodity status of animals would not be invalidated by that. A philosophical idealist movement that just wants nobody to ever eat animals and thinks that anyone participating in a predator-prey relationship that isn't, the Inuit are wrong. That would be invalidated by that, right? This is why we've been arguing for this for so many years.
Such a discovery would absolutely invalidate a movement against the commodity status of animals. The primary way in which animals are commodified is for food. If it's proven beyond a doubt that people need to eat animals, then their commodification would be validated. We could still fight for lab-grown meat, but our movement would be set back majorly.
But it's just really telling when people move to this extreme kind of disavowal instead of just listening to somebody and being like, damn, I'm sorry that was your experience, but you seem to be finally in a better place, and that's really good. Here are all these other ways that you could contribute to ending animal agriculture. And, I honestly wonder how many people are suffering out there and who are just terrified to listen to their doctors or of losing their circle or whatever. I will say that absolutely nobody in real life was ever remotely shitty about this. Nobody. All of my vegan comrades were super supportive, saying this is not a deal breaker. We will absolutely still organize together. And good for you for finally being not sick. I see that you're so much better, and I trust you to know what is livable and what is not livable inside your body.
It's really telling that Mexie demands that strangers on the internet just take her at her word. It sounds like she's cultivated a group of friends that can never question or disagree with each other, only validate each other. Sounds healthy.
But like, yeah, people are justified because they're like, oh, I'm doing this for the animals. I mean, which animals are being helped by this? Like, this movement is harassing like the most marginalized people, like vilifying poor people, disabled people, indigenous people. Like, holy fuck. I mean, you really think you're going to change systems this way? It's unbelievable.
This is toxic aid poll garbage. Marginalized people can and often do participate in various forms of oppression. Your marginalized status does not give you a pass to victimize others. Merely pointing this out is not harassment. Please watch my video on bullying and harassment. And yes, I recognize that my message is not popular, but you don't change systems by coddling oppressors.
I mean, you honestly wouldn't grill people on most other forms of consumption that could be extremely environmentally destructive or socially destructive or kill a lot of animals. I mean, people argue that the rainforest is only being raised for meat and nothing else, and that the soybean plantations come later. That's not always the case. So, where is your tofu coming from, guys? Where is your quinoa coming from? Where is your chocolate coming from? Your almond milk? Your cell phone was made by destroying the environment in the Congo and involves child slavery and death. You could argue that you need your cell phone to operate in this world, but many could argue against that. The point is that people don't consider people who buy cell phones or fast fashion innately immoral people because you understand that it is the system that is evil. And then people are just within the system forced to make bad choices. Like, you wouldn't go up to somebody and be like, dude, you're literally killing children in Bangladesh with your fast fashion. I used to take several long-haul flights per year in academia, and my ex-partner used to razz me about it because we did the calculations, and the flights effectively undid the environmental good of my vegan diet, and then some. Although, as we mentioned, it is more complicated than it appears. It's really not necessarily a straight line between individual action and harm reduction anyway, and we know that, environmental footprints were created largely by oil execs to distract us from systemic issues. However, that was the joke, like that my flights were effectively completely undoing the good I was doing with my vegan diet. Nobody came to me and said, Mexie, my God, I mean, why would you take those flights? You're literally driving global ecocide. But eating plant-based or not feels like one of the few areas of consumption that people will grill and judge individuals for and act like they are single-handedly responsible for the harm that these industries are enacting. Like, they are not just poor laborers acting within a horrible, evil, terrible system, making the best choices that they can with what they have and what their situation is.
1. I shop almost exclusively secondhand. I don't support sweatshops. 2. I don't buy almond milk, but I also do not claim to be a perfect consumer who always makes the best choices I can. 3. I never said you were an innately immoral person. And 4. You literally just said your ex used to grill you about your flights. Influencers get grilled for promoting brands like Shein, and rightfully so. The reason veganism elicits more emotion is because of how direct and egregious the harm is. As horrible as human rights abuses are in food, tech, and clothing industries, there is currently no industry that slaughters humans by the billions.
And that doesn't justify what's going on in animal agriculture. I mean, I wouldn't have been abstaining from this industry for 20 years or make a bunch of content about it, make a whole platform about it, go to vegan conferences about it, go to vegan marches, if I didn't think the industry is egregious. Like, the industry has to go. There's no justification for this industry. But I bet you're not up in anyone's face about the other egregious forms of consumption that they participate in, or just poring over the minutia of like whether it's really necessary for them to do that. You are not the arbiter of what is necessary for someone else. You're not. The sooner the movement learns that, the better.
When it comes to nutrition, you are not the arbiter of what is necessary for yourself. Science is. Also, I'm sick of influencers acting like they're no different than Joe Schmo eating lunch in the break room at Home Depot. You put yourself out there on a public platform. Criticism is par for the course. I'm not up in people's faces about what they're eating in my day-to-day life. I'm responding to scientific claims made on a podcast.
People were like, well, you weren't forceful enough in saying that everyone who can consume this way should. Sure. Yes, good. But the reason I'm also hesitant on that isn't because I don't support it, but there are so many reasons why somebody may not be able to be plant-based currently, including mental health struggles, eating disorders, living situations, and you don't know what someone is going through. You honestly don't know. And so I have never brought people on the podcast to talk about consumption, never. I had people reaching out wanting to come on and talk about food, vegan winter wear, and a bunch of stuff. I said no, always. Because this is a political show. I'm not interested in telling people what to consume and how to consume it. And many vegans will take the point that people should do what they can, which yeah, sure, of course. But they will use it to go around policing people and badgering them about whether they really are ill or they really have an eating disorder or they really this or that. Can you really not consume better? It's just super antagonistic, super ableist, and not okay.
What does Mexie think politics is? Broadly defined, politics is the total complex of relations between people living in society. Our consumption is inherently political. Her message is so contradictory. She says she doesn't want to dissuade people from being vegan, yet she validates every excuse positioned as, this is necessary for me. I don't question whether people are really ill or really have an eating disorder. I believe them. I question whether these are valid reasons to violate the rights of other sentient beings. In conclusion, I don't think Mexie is a bad person. I think she's a speciesist people pleaser. She is far more concerned with protecting people's feelings than she is with protecting animal rights. And that's a shame. Thank you so much for listening. Please give this video a thumbs up and stay tuned for my next video debunking Gary Francione's turf essay. That'll be a fun one. Alright, peace out.